Imagine the searing heat of bronze, glowing red in the heart of an ancient city, a cauldron vast and heavy, filled not with water, but with oil thick and shimmering, its surface quivering like molten gold. The camera drifts closer. We hear the creak of ropes, the groan of wood, the murmurs of a restless crowd. Above it, a man is bound, his body broken by torture, his eyes unable to close against the blinding sun. His once proud frame now suspended, inch by inch, lowered toward a fate so cruel that even his enemies fall silent. The first wisp of steam licks against his feet. His flesh tightens. The crowd holds its breath. This was not a nameless victim of antiquity. This was Marcus Atilius Regulus, Roman general, consul, a man who once brought empires to their knees. And yet, here he hangs, about to be consumed alive, not by steel but by fire and oil. A pause. The sound of his muffled cry echoes, swallowed by the roar of boiling liquid. But how does a celebrated hero of Rome become the centerpiece of one of the most terrifying executions in history? Before we descend further into this chilling tale, I invite you to join us here on Cursed Chronicles. If stories of honor, cruelty, and the darkest shadows of history captivate you, then subscribe now and step with us into the past where curses never die. The silence after his scream lingers, but history does not pause. To understand how Marcus Atilius Regulus reached this moment of agony, we must step back into the world he once commanded. Rome was rising, its legions hardened by decades of conquest across the Italian peninsula. Yet beyond the sea lay Carthage, a maritime power whose fleets controlled the trade routes of the Mediterranean. These two giants could not coexist, and their collision ignited the First Punic War, a struggle that would rage for over 20 years. Rome, long a land-bound force, dared to challenge Carthage at sea. With staggering ambition, the Republic built an entire navy from scratch, turning farmers into sailors, and in time, wresting victories from the very masters of the waves. It was in this crucible of war that Marcus Atilius Regulus rose. Twice elected consul, he embodied the Roman virtues of discipline, courage, and unbending will. His name was whispered with respect, even fear. When he was chosen to lead Rome's bold invasion of North Africa, it seemed destiny itself had selected him for greatness. Across the Mediterranean, Regulus sailed with one of the largest armadas Rome had ever assembled. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, an iron tide rolling toward the shores of Carthage. The sight of Roman sails blotting out the horizon struck terror into a city that had for centuries known only power and dominance. For the first time, Carthaginian mothers could hear Roman war horns echo across their fields. Panic gripped the streets. Regulus landed with precision, his troops carving a path of devastation across the countryside. Cities fell, treasures poured into Roman hands, and prisoners were marched in chains as proof of Roman supremacy. It seemed as though Carthage itself would crumble before him. When the ruling council finally sued for peace, they expected terms, harsh, yes, but survivable. What they received instead was humiliation. Regulus demanded everything: the surrender of Sicily and Sardinia, crushing reparations, and the reduction of Carthage to a shadow of its former self. He would strip them of their fleets, their pride, their very identity as a maritime empire. These terms were not offers, they were shackles. For Regulus, compromise was weakness. Rome demanded nothing less than complete submission. But in this merciless ambition lay his fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken Carthage's desperation for surrender, blind to the storm that was gathering against him. A storm that would soon drag him from the heights of glory to the depths of torment. Do you think Regulus was too arrogant with his demands? Or just being a true Roman? Let us know in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. The arrogance of Rome's demands left Carthage cornered, humiliated, and desperate. But desperation can summon strange saviors. From across the sea came a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, a man forged in the traditions of the phalanx, disciplined, clear-eyed, and ruthless. Unlike the generals who had stumbled before him, Xanthippus studied the terrain, the enemy, and the psychology of war. He saw what others had missed. The flat plains near Tunis were perfect not for infantry, but for cavalry and elephants. When the armies met in 255 BC, Regulus marched with the same confidence that had carried him through victory after victory. His men, drunk on triumph and laden with plunder, believed they could not be stopped. Yet the battlefield that day would strip them of both pride and flesh. The earth shook beneath the charge of Carthage's were elephants, massive beasts armored for destruction, crashing into Roman lines like living siege engines. Their trumpeting calls pierced the air as Roman formations splintered, discipline crumbling under chaos. Cavalry swept the flanks, cutting off escape, while the infantry pressed relentlessly forward. The legions, famed for their iron resolve, faltered under the weight of a strategy designed to shatter them. Within hours, Rome's dream of seizing Africa turned into a nightmare of blood and dust. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, the fields soaked red with the ruin of an army that had once marched invincible. Amid the carnage, Marcus Atilius Regulus did not flee. Accounts speak of him fighting with unyielding valor, his sword flashing even as the tide swallowed his men. But courage alone could not stem the flood. Exhausted, wounded, surrounded, Regulus was dragged down and bound. For Carthage, his capture was no ordinary prize. This was no faceless officer, but a consul of Rome, a man whose very name carried weight in the Senate. They did not throw him into chains of misery. Not yet. Instead, they treated him with a grim respect. His quarters were bearable, his status acknowledged. He was not just a prisoner. He was a bargaining chip, a living symbol of Rome's vulnerability. For years he remained in this limbo, confined yet not destroyed, his presence reminding Carthage that it held Rome's honor in its grasp. Then came the gamble. As the war dragged on, bleeding both empires of men and treasure, Carthage saw an opportunity. They sent Regulus back to Rome as an emissary, under oath sworn on the gods themselves. He would plead their case, urge peace, and in return he would gain freedom. But if peace was denied, he was bound, by honor, by sacred vow, to return to Carthage and face whatever awaited him. The Senate gathered to hear him, their chamber heavy with the memory of his triumphs and their grief at his capture. They expected pleas for mercy, arguments for compromise. What they received instead was fire. Regulus stood before them, worn by captivity, yet unbroken in spirit. He urged not peace, but war. He told them Carthage's offers were weakness disguised as generosity, that surrender would mean Rome's ruin. He argued with the voice of a man who knew he was signing his own death sentence. His words weighted with the gravity of sacrifice. In that moment, Regulus ceased to be merely a general. He became a martyr in waiting, a man who placed the destiny of Rome above his life, above his family, above the very flesh that still carried his breath. When his speech ended, the Senate sat in stunned silence, knowing they had heard both wisdom and tragedy entwined in one voice. If this part of the story shocks you, imagine what comes next. Stay with us, and if you haven't yet, hit that like button so more people can uncover this lost chapter of history. When Regulus returned to Carthage, the silence that met him was not the silence of respect but of calculation. The men who once treated him as a bargaining piece now regarded him as a traitor to their designs. They had entrusted him with a mission of peace, and he had chosen war. To them, this was betrayal carved in flesh, and flesh was what they would punish. The cruelty that followed was not sudden or frenzied. It was meticulous, measured, and deliberate, a theater of suffering designed to strip him of dignity inch by inch. His captors did not want a swift death. They wanted to craft a spectacle, a message that would echo beyond their city walls, a slow unraveling of a man who once embodied the pride of Rome. They began with his sleep. Days passed without rest, torches blazing in his chamber, drums and shouts echoing through the night. His mind grew heavy, his body weak, but the deprivation left no scars, only exhaustion that hollowed his strength and blurred the edges of his will. When he staggered but did not yield, they escalated. Mirrors of polished bronze were tilted to catch the blinding African sun, directing its burning light into his eyes. Each hour of daylight became torture, each ray of sun a spear that pierced his skull. Then came the mutilation. They cut away his eyelids, robbing him of the mercy of darkness, forcing his gaze wide open to the brilliance that seared his vision. Day after day, he stood exposed, unable to hide from the blaze, his sight withering under the relentless glare. Still Regulus endured. His captors grew restless, angered by his resilience. They devised a new torment, the spiked box, a narrow coffin of wood and iron, its walls lined with sharp points. Inside it, he could not move, not even to breathe deeply, without his flesh tearing against the barbs. Each twitch, each involuntary spasm, became its own punishment. His body became his enemy, betraying him with pain at every motion. Within this prison of iron thorns, Regulus was reduced to a trembling husk, his skin pierced, his wounds festering, his breath shallow. Yet witnesses spoke of his composure, his refusal to cry out in madness or beg for release. He clung to the last remnants of dignity, and in that defiance, he robbed his captors of the victory they craved. But their patience was finite. A final act was planned, one that would outshine every cruelty that had preceded it. A bronze cauldron was prepared, vast enough to hold a man, filled not with water but with oil. Slowly, deliberately, it was set over fire, the heat rising, the surface trembling until it seethed and spat. Before a gathering crowd, Marcus Atilius Regulus was brought forth. His body bore the marks of every torment, eyes inflamed, skin torn, limbs weakened. Yet he carried himself with the bearing of a Roman consul, dignified even as death loomed. The ropes tightened around his arms. The pulleys groaned. Inch by inch, the proud general was lowered toward the shimmering surface. When the first touch of heat licked at his feet, the crowd hushed. The sound of flesh meeting oil split the air, followed by a cry that echoed against the stones of Carthage. His agony became the city's theater, his death their declaration. Do you feel he endured this as a fool clinging to pride, or as a hero whose spirit outlasted flesh? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you stand on this haunting divide between honor and survival. As the oil boiled and the ropes groaned, Regulus's body descended into the cauldron that had been prepared as both punishment and spectacle. The surface broke with a hiss, steam rising in great plumes, curling around his figure like the smoke of an unholy sacrifice. The smell of burning flesh drifted across the crowd, sickening even those who had come thirsting for vengeance. Some turned their faces away. Others watched transfixed, unable to tear their eyes from the horror before them. The executioners worked with precision, controlling the pace of his descent. He was not dropped to his death, but lowered slowly, cruelly, inch by inch. Each moment extended. Each scream wrung from him stretched into a sound that seemed to linger in the very stones of Carthage. His voice, once commanding legions, now fractured into cries that spoke of pain too great for language. The oil clung to him, searing, devouring. His body convulsed against the ropes, but there was no escape, no relief. For a time, the city that had survived on trade and strategy stood in utter silence, every ear and every eye fixed on the man who once had dared to dictate their fate. Even among his enemies, the spectacle of such suffering weighed heavily. The Carthaginians had intended a triumph, a statement of power, yet what unfolded resembled something darker, an admission of fear, an act of vengeance that revealed as much weakness as strength. Regulus's consciousness did not last long. The extremity of heat overwhelmed his body, shock claiming him faster than his captors may have wished. His final moments were a blur of pain and flame, but witnesses insist that even as his body failed, his bearing held a strange dignity. He had walked willingly into death, bound not by his chains, but by his oath. In dying, he had denied Carthage the victory of breaking his spirit. When at last the ropes were released and his body disappeared into the cauldron, a deeper silence fell, a silence more terrible than any roar of triumph could have been. The crowd dispersed slowly, not jubilant but subdued, shaken by what they had seen. For some, the memory would never fade. For others, it would fester as a curse, a reminder of the darkness that men inflict when vengeance rules their hearts. And so Marcus Atilius Regulus perished, not on the battlefield where soldiers find their glory, but in oil and fire, transformed into a martyr through cruelty. Carthage had destroyed his body, but in doing so, they created something far more dangerous. A legend, a tale that would cross seas and generations, inspiring vengeance and stirring Roman resolve long after his screams had faded into silence. News of Regulus's death did not creep quietly into Rome. It struck like a thunderclap. Traitors, envoys, and captives carried whispers of what had been done, and each retelling grew darker, more detailed, until the image of a Roman consul boiling alive in oil burned itself into the collective imagination of the Republic. The Senate, which had once wrestled with the moral weight of his oath, now felt no ambiguity. Their colleague had returned to Carthage not to plead for his life, but to honor his word and defend Rome, and for that, he had been tortured, mutilated, and consumed. What had been a political calculation for Carthage became, for Rome, a sacred outrage. His widow, Marcia, emerged as the vessel of that rage. She demanded vengeance not in speeches, but in deeds. Carthaginian prisoners who had been taken in war were no longer treated as bargaining chips. Under her influence, some were subjected to the same torments her husband had endured. Confined in spiked boxes, deprived of sleep, exposed to the elements. In Rome's thirst for retribution, cruelty begot cruelty, and the cycle of suffering turned with a momentum that neither city could easily stop. Yet amid the horror, Regulus was elevated into something more than a victim. He became a symbol, a mirror in which Romans saw their highest ideals reflected. His choice to return to Carthage when he could have remained safe was retold as the ultimate act of honor, his speech in the Senate as a model of duty, his death as proof that the Republic produced men whose integrity could not be broken by pain. His story was recited in forums, sung in verse, inscribed into the memory of the Republic. Children grew up learning that Marcus Atilius Regulus had chosen principle over survival, and that such sacrifice was the foundation upon which Rome stood. If stories like this stir something deep within you, join us here on Cursed Chronicles. Subscribe, so you never miss the moments where history's darkest shadows reveal the light and the curses that still linger.